The scandal broke on a Tuesday morning in the summer of 1878 when James Sullivan walked into the First Baptist Church of Cheyenne, Wyoming Territory with Rosa Martinez on his arm and a diamond ring gleaming on her finger. Pastor Elijah Thompson looked up from his ledger, his wire-rimmed spectacles sliding down his nose as he took in the pair standing before him. James was a respected ranch hand from the Double S Ranch, a man who had attended services faithfully for 3 years since arriving from Missouri. Rosa, however, was different. She had worked at the Golden Rose Saloon for the past year, serving drinks and singing for the patrons, and that single fact seemed to erase every other truth about her in the pastor's mind. "Pastor Thompson," James said, his voice steady despite the tension radiating through his broad shoulders, "Rosa and I would like to be married. We were hoping you could perform the ceremony next month." The pastor set down his pen with deliberate slowness, his lips pressing into a thin line. He stood smoothing the front of his black vest and walked around the desk until he stood directly before them. His eyes barely glanced at James before fixing on Rosa with unmistakable disdain. "Mr. Sullivan, might I have a word with you privately?" Pastor Thompson's voice carried the weight of judgment. Rosa's fingers tightened around James's arm, but he did not move. "Anything you need to say to me can be said in front of my future wife." The pastor's jaw clenched. "Very well. I cannot in good conscience perform a marriage ceremony that would bind a Christian man to a woman of such questionable virtue. Miss Martinez's employment at that establishment of sin makes her an unsuitable bride for any God-fearing man." The words hit Rosa like physical blows, but she lifted her chin, refusing to let this man see her flinch. She had expected this, had warned James it would happen, but hearing it spoken aloud still carved into her heart. "Rosa left the saloon 2 weeks ago," James said, his voice hardening. "Not that it should matter. She served drinks and sang songs. She did nothing shameful." "The mere association with such a place taints her reputation beyond repair," Pastor Thompson replied. "I will not bless a union that goes against the moral standards of this community. My decision is final." James opened his mouth to argue further, but Rosa tugged gently on his sleeve. "Let us go, James. Please." They walked out into the bright Wyoming sunshine, and Rosa felt the weight of failure settling over her shoulders. She had known it was a risk, had known that her past would follow her like a shadow, but James had been so certain, so confident that love would be enough. "I am sorry," she whispered as they stood on the church steps. "I told you this would happen." James turned to her, his green eyes fierce with determination. "No, do not apologize for his narrow-mindedness. We will find another way, Rosa. I promise you that." She wanted to believe him, but doubt gnawed at her insides. In a town like Cheyenne, the Baptist church was the center of social life. Without Pastor Thompson's blessing, they would be outcasts, and James would lose the respect he had worked so hard to earn. "Maybe we should wait," Rosa suggested, though the words tasted bitter. "Give it time. Let people forget about where I worked." "I do not want to wait." James took both her hands in his right there on the church steps where anyone could see. "I want to marry you, Rosa Martinez. I want to wake up beside you every morning and fall asleep with you in my arms every night. I want to build a life with you, have children with you, grow old with you, and I will not let one man's prejudice stand in our way." Tears pricked at Rosa's eyes, but she blinked them back. She had cried enough tears in her life. First when her parents died of fever when she was 16, then when she had been forced to take work at the saloon to survive. She had promised herself that when she finally found happiness, she would not let fear steal it away. "Then what do we do?" she asked. James was quiet for a moment, his brow furrowed in thought. Then his expression brightened. "Circuit riders. There are Methodist circuit riders who travel through the territory, preaching and performing ceremonies in places that do not have established churches. They are known for being less rigid, more focused on the spirit of faith than the letter of judgment." Hope flickered in Rosa's chest. "Do you know how to find one?" Old Tom at the general store knows everyone who passes through Cheyenne. If anyone knows when a circuit rider is coming through, it will be him." They walked hand in hand down the dusty main street, past the mercantile and the telegraph office, past the saloon where Rosa used to work, and where her former boss, Sally Jenkins, stood in the doorway. Sally was a hard woman with a soft heart, and when she saw Rosa, she gave her a small nod of encouragement. Rosa smiled back, grateful for the silent support. The general store smelled of leather and tobacco, coffee beans, and soap. Old Tom stood behind the counter, his white beard reaching halfway down his chest, his eyes sharp despite his 70-some years. "James, Rosa," he greeted them warmly. "What brings you two in today?" James explained their situation, leaving out the painful details of Pastor Thompson's rejection, but making it clear they needed to find a circuit rider. Tom listened carefully, stroking his beard thoughtfully. "Well, now you are in luck," Tom said after a moment. "I heard tell that Reverend Samuel Coleman is making his rounds through the territory. He should be passing through the settlements east of here within the next week or two. Last I heard, he was heading toward Pine Bluffs, then planned to swing back through some of the ranch country before moving north." "How would we find him?" Rosa asked. Tom pulled out a worn map from beneath his counter, spreading it across the scarred wooden surface. "Coleman follows a regular circuit more or less. He stays where people invite him, preaches where there is a need, and helps folks who need spiritual guidance. If you head out toward Pine Bluffs and ask around, someone will know where he is. He is a good man, fair-minded, and kind. I think he would be willing to help you." James studied the map, his finger tracing the route. "That is about 40 miles east. We could make it in 2 days on horseback if we ride steady." Rosa felt excitement and nervousness warring in her stomach. It was one thing to hope for a solution, another to actually pursue it. But looking at James's determined profile, seeing the love and commitment in every line of his face, she knew she would follow him anywhere. "When should we leave?" she asked. "Tomorrow morning at first light," James said. "I will talk to the foreman tonight, let him know I need a few days. He owes me for covering his duties last month when his wife was sick, and I will arrange for horses and supplies." Tom folded up the map with a smile. "You two are good together. Do not let anyone tell you different. Love like yours is rare, and it deserves to be honored." Those words stayed with Rosa throughout the rest of the day as she packed her few belongings into a canvas bag. She had a room in a modest boarding house run by Mrs. Chen, a Chinese widow, who had always treated Rosa with kindness. When Rosa explained where she was going and why, Mrs. Chen clasped her hands warmly. "You find happiness," Mrs. Chen said in her accented English. "You deserve good man, good life. Do not let cruel words stop you." That evening, James came to the boarding house with 2 horses already saddled and loaded with supplies. He had brought food, water, blankets, and even a small tent in case they needed to camp along the way. His thoroughness made Rosa smile. "You think of everything," she said. "I want to take care of you," he replied simply. "Always." They left Cheyenne before dawn, the sky still painted with stars, the air cool and crisp. Rosa had never been much of a rider, but James had chosen a gentle mare for her, and he rode close beside her, ready to help if needed. As the sun rose over the vast Wyoming plains, painting the grass gold and the sky pink, Rosa felt a sense of freedom she had never experienced before. The first day of riding was long and tiring. They stopped occasionally to rest the horses and eat, but mostly they kept a steady pace, following the rutted wagon road that connected Cheyenne to the smaller settlements scattered across the territory. James told her stories about his childhood in Missouri, about his parents who had died when he was 19, about how he had come west looking for a fresh start and found work on the Double S Ranch. "I never expected to fall in love," he admitted, as they watered the horses at a creek in the early afternoon. "I thought I would just work, save money, maybe buy my own land someday. But then I walked into the Golden Rose one night because the other ranch hands dragged me there, and I heard you singing." Rosa remembered that night. She had been singing an old Spanish song her mother had taught her, something sad and beautiful about lost love and distant homes. When she had finished, she had looked up and seen a tall cowboy with sun-bronzed skin and kind eyes watching her from the back of the room. "You came back the next night," she said softly, "and the night after that. I could not stay away. Your voice, your spirit, the way you held your head high even when men said inappropriate things, you were so strong, Rosa. So beautiful. I knew I had to know you." They had courted quietly at first, meeting for walks outside of town, sharing meals at the small Mexican restaurant on the edge of Cheyenne. James had never made her feel ashamed of her work, had never treated her as anything less than a lady. He had seen her for who she truly was, not what circumstances had forced her to become. By nightfall, they reached a small ranch where a family named Morrison welcomed travelers. Mr. Morrison was a weathered cattleman with a booming laugh, and his wife was a plump woman with flour on her apron and warmth in her eyes. They had 4 children ranging from 6 to 15, and the whole family gathered around the dinner table to hear about James and Rosa's quest. "Pastor Thompson refused you?" Mrs. Morrison said, shaking her head in disgust. "That man has more pride than Christian charity. I have always said so." "Now, Martha," Mr. Morrison cautioned, though he did not look like he disagreed. "Well, it is true," she insisted. "The Lord taught us to love our neighbors, not to judge them. I think you two are doing the right thing, finding someone who will see your love for what it is." The Morrison children listened with wide eyes, clearly finding the whole adventure terribly romantic. The oldest daughter, a girl of 15 named Annie, sighed dreamily. "I hope someone loves me enough to ride across the territory for me someday." That night, James and Rosa slept in the barn, separated by a respectful distance and a stack of hay bales, but close enough that Rosa could hear James breathing in the darkness. She felt safe, protected, and more hopeful than she had in years. The next day they reached Pine Bluffs, a small settlement of perhaps 20 buildings clustered around a general store and a blacksmith shop. James asked around about Reverend Coleman, and they were directed to a homestead about 5 miles north where the circuit rider had stayed the previous night. When they arrived at the homestead, however, they learned that Coleman had already moved on, heading northwest toward a sheep ranch where a family wanted their twin babies baptized. The homesteader, a young man named Lucas, gave them directions and warned them that the route was rough. "It will take you off the main roads," Lucas said, "but Reverend Coleman is worth the trouble of finding. He married my sister and her husband last year when they had a similar problem with judgmental church folk. He believes marriage is a sacred bond, and he does not turn people away because of gossip." Encouraged, James and Rosa set out northwest, following deer trails and wagon ruts through increasingly wild country. The landscape changed as they rode, becoming more rugged, with rocky outcroppings and steep hills. The horses picked their way carefully, and James kept his rifle ready in case they encountered wolves or hostile travelers. That evening, as they made camp beside a clear stream, Rosa felt the weight of the journey settling into her bones. She was saddle-sore and tired, but also exhilarated. She had never been so far from civilization, had never experienced the wild beauty of the open territory like this. James built a fire and cooked beans and bacon in a cast-iron skillet, and they ate while watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. The vastness of the universe made Rosa feel small, but also connected to something larger than herself. "Are you scared?" James asked quietly. "No," Rosa answered honestly, "not when I am with you." He moved closer, wrapping a blanket around both their shoulders. "I love you, Rosa Martinez, more than I have ever loved anything or anyone." "I love you too, James Sullivan, with all my heart." They sat like that until the fire burned down to embers, and then they retreated to their separate bedrolls, though Rosa found it harder than ever to sleep apart from the man she loved. The third day brought them to the sheep ranch, a sprawling property with hundreds of woolly animals dotting the hillsides. The ranch was run by a Scottish family named McDougall, and when James and Rosa arrived, they found Reverend Samuel Coleman sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee talking theology with Mr. McDougall. Coleman was younger than Rosa had expected, perhaps 40, with a lean, weathered face and eyes that held both wisdom and kindness. He wore simple traveling clothes, dusty from the road, and his horse was tied nearby, looking as tired as Rosa felt. When James explained why they had tracked him down, Coleman listened without interruption, his expression thoughtful. When James finished, the circuit rider was quiet for a long moment. "Pastor Thompson is a good man in many ways," Coleman finally said, "but he has forgotten that Christ dined with tax collectors and sinners, that he showed compassion to the woman at the well, that he defended the adulteress from those who would stone her. The church is meant to be a place of redemption, not condemnation." Hope surged in Rosa's chest. "Then you will marry us?" Coleman smiled, and it transformed his serious face. "I would be honored to marry you. Love is a gift from God, and when two people find it, it should be celebrated and blessed, not rejected because of fear or prejudice. However, I must ask you both some questions first to ensure you understand the commitment you are making." They spent the next hour talking with Coleman, answering his questions about their relationship, their faith, their hopes for the future. The Reverend asked Rosa about her background, and she told him honestly about losing her parents, about the necessity that had driven her to the saloon, about the shame she had carried and the redemption she had found in James's love. Coleman reached across and took her hand gently. "Miss Martinez, there is no shame in survival. You did what you needed to do to live, and you did it with dignity. That takes courage. Any man of God who cannot see that is blinded by his own self-righteousness." The words broke something open inside Rosa, and tears spilled down her cheeks. James put his arm around her, and she leaned into his strength, feeling truly seen and accepted for the first time since her parents had died. "When would you like to be married?" Coleman asked. James looked at Rosa, his eyes questioning. She nodded, her heart too full for words. "As soon as possible," James said. "Today, if you are willing." Coleman laughed, a warm, genuine sound. "Today it is, then. Let me speak with the McDougals and see if we can arrange a proper ceremony. Even a small wedding should be witnessed and celebrated." Mrs. McDougall was delighted by the idea and immediately began organizing. She had 3 daughters who were thrilled to have a wedding to attend, and they insisted on helping Rosa prepare. They brought out a beautiful white dress that had belonged to Mrs. McDougall's mother, altered it quickly to fit Rosa's smaller frame, and wove wildflowers into her dark hair. Rosa looked at herself in the small mirror in the McDougall's bedroom and barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked happy, radiant, like someone who had found her place in the world. The ceremony took place at sunset on a hillside overlooking the sheep ranch, with the mountains purple in the distance and the sky streaked with orange and gold. The McDougall family stood as witnesses, their children quiet for once, sensing the sacredness of the moment. James wore his best shirt, his hair slicked back, his hands trembling slightly as he took Rosa's. Reverend Coleman opened his worn Bible and began to speak, his voice carrying across the hilltop. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here in the sight of God and these witnesses to join James Sullivan and Rosa Martinez in holy matrimony. Marriage is not to be entered into lightly, but reverently, deliberately, and in accordance with the purposes for which it was instituted by God." Rosa listened to the familiar words, but they felt different now, personal and profound. When Coleman asked if there were any objections, the silence was complete except for the wind rustling through the grass. "James Sullivan, do you take Rosa Martinez to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do you part?" "I do," James said, his voice strong and clear. "Rosa Martinez, do you take James Sullivan to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do you part?" "I do," Rosa whispered, then said it louder. "I do." James slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, one he had bought in Cheyenne weeks ago, hoping for this moment. Rosa's hands shook as she placed a matching band on his finger, a ring she had saved for months to purchase. "By the power vested in me by God and the Methodist Church, I now pronounce you husband and wife. James, you may kiss your bride." James cupped Rosa's face in his hands and kissed her tenderly, and Rosa felt the last of her fears dissolve. They were married. Despite Pastor Thompson's rejection, despite the gossip and judgment of Cheyenne society, they were husband and wife before God and these kind witnesses. The McDougals cheered, and Mrs. McDougall had tears streaming down her face. She had prepared a feast for the occasion, and they all gathered in the ranch house for a celebration that lasted late into the night. There was roasted lamb and fresh bread, vegetables from the garden, and even a cake that the McDougall daughters had baked and decorated with wildflowers. Reverend Coleman played a fiddle surprisingly well, and Mr. McDougall danced with his wife while the children spun in circles. James pulled Rosa into his arms and danced with her under the lamplight, their bodies moving together as naturally as breathing. "Mrs. Sullivan," James murmured into her hair, "how does that sound?" "Like everything I have ever wanted," Rosa answered. That night, the McDougals offered them the small guest cabin at the edge of the property, a private space where they could begin their married life. Rosa felt nervous and excited as they walked hand in hand through the darkness, the sounds of celebration fading behind them. Inside the cabin, James lit a lantern, and warm light filled the simple room. There was a bed covered in a colorful quilt, a washstand with a pitcher and basin, a rocking chair in the corner. It was modest but clean and welcoming. "Are you happy?" James asked, turning to face her. "I am happier than I ever thought possible," Rosa said truthfully. He crossed the room and pulled her close, his hands gentle on her waist. "I will spend every day of my life making sure you never regret marrying me." "I could never regret this, James. You are my miracle." They kissed, and this time there was no interruption, no need to pull away or maintain propriety. They were husband and wife, bound by law and faith and love. Rosa let herself sink into the feeling, into the rightness of being in James's arms, of belonging completely to someone who saw her, truly saw her, and loved what he saw. The night was tender and sweet, filled with whispered words and gentle touches, with the discovery of each other and the joy of finally being together without barriers. When Rosa finally fell asleep in her husband's arms, she felt complete in a way she had never experienced before. They stayed at the McDougall Ranch for 2 more days, helping with chores and enjoying the hospitality of their new friends. Reverend Coleman remained as well, resting before continuing his circuit, and Rosa found herself having long conversations with him about faith and forgiveness, about finding God in unexpected places. "You have a strong spirit, Mrs. Sullivan," Coleman told her on the second day, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "Do not let anyone convince you that your worth is determined by your past. God's grace is infinite, and His love is unconditional. Remember that when you return to Cheyenne and face those who judged you." "I am not sure we will return to Cheyenne," Rosa admitted. "James loves his work at the Double S Ranch, but I fear the town will never accept me as his wife." Coleman nodded thoughtfully. "That is a decision you and James must make together. But know this, wherever you go, you carry your dignity and your love with you. No one can take that away unless you let them." When they finally said goodbye to the McDougals and Reverend Coleman, Rosa felt like she was leaving family behind. Mrs. McDougall hugged her tightly and made her promise to write. The children gave them gifts, wildflower seeds, a carved wooden horse, a drawing of their wedding. Coleman shook James's hand and kissed Rosa's cheek, blessing them both for the journey ahead. The ride back to Cheyenne was different from the journey out. Rosa and James were married now, and they camped together under the stars, held each other through the cool nights, talked about their dreams and plans. James wanted to save enough money to buy land and start his own ranch. Rosa wanted to plant a garden, maybe raise chickens, perhaps even teach the children of other Mexican families who struggled with English the way she once had. "We could start our own life," James said as they rode through the morning sunshine on the 4th day. "Away from Cheyenne, away from judgment. There is good land for sale north of here near the Montana border. We could build a house, raise cattle, be our own people." "What about your job at the Double S?" Rosa asked. "I have been working for someone else for 3 years," James said. "I want to work for us now, for our future. I have saved almost $300. It is enough to buy land and supplies to start. It will be hard work, but we would be building something that is ours." Rosa felt excitement stirring in her chest. A fresh start. A place where no one knew her past, where she and James could simply be husband and wife without the shadow of judgment hanging over them. "Yes," she said, "let us do it. Let us build our own life." They decided to return to Cheyenne only long enough for James to collect his final wages and for Rosa to gather her remaining belongings. They would not announce their marriage publicly, would not confront Pastor Thompson, or try to change anyone's mind. They would simply move forward, leaving the judgment and prejudice behind. When they rode into Cheyenne on a bright Saturday morning, the town looked different to Rosa. She no longer felt small or ashamed riding down the main street. She was a married woman, blessed by a man of God, loved by a good man, and she held her head high. They went first to the boarding house, where Mrs. Chen greeted Rosa with delight, noticing the ring on her finger immediately. "You married," she exclaimed. "I am so happy for you." Rosa introduced James as her husband, and Mrs. Chen insisted they stay for tea while Rosa packed her things. As they sat in the small parlor, Rosa told her about Reverend Coleman and the wedding on the hillside, about the McDougals and their kindness. "Good people are everywhere," Mrs. Chen said wisely. "Bad people, too. You found the good ones. That is blessing." At the Double S Ranch, the foreman was less understanding. He looked at James with disappointment when James explained that he was leaving to start his own place. "You are making a mistake, Sullivan," the foreman said. "That woman will ruin you. You could have had a future here, but you are throwing it away for a saloon girl." James's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level. "That woman is my wife, and she is worth more than any job. I will collect my wages and be gone by tomorrow." The foreman paid him what he was owed, but the friendly relationship they had built over 3 years was clearly over. Some of the other ranch hands tried to talk James out of leaving, but a few, the ones who had met Rosa and recognized her worth, shook his hand and wished him well. That evening, as James and Rosa prepared to leave Cheyenne for good, Sally Jenkins appeared at the boarding house. The saloon owner had a package wrapped in brown paper under her arm. "I heard you got married," Sally said, her voice gruff but her eyes soft. "Heard you found some traveling preacher who was not too high and mighty to do it." "We did," Rosa confirmed. "We leave tomorrow for the North Country. James is going to start his own ranch." Sally thrust the package at her. "This is for you. Call it a wedding present." Inside the package was a beautiful quilt, hand-stitched with intricate patterns in blues and golds. Rosa gasped. "Sally, this is too much." "It was my mother's," Sally said. "She was a good woman, would have liked you. You reminded me of her, actually. Strong, proud, did not let the world break you. I want you to have it to keep you warm in your new home." Rosa hugged the older woman, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you. For everything. For giving me work when I needed it. For treating me with respect." "You earned that respect, girl. Now go be happy. Show the world that judgmental fools like Thompson do not get to decide who deserves love." They left Cheyenne the next morning without fanfare, 2 horses packed with supplies and hopes, heading north into uncertain but promising territory. The journey took them through wild country, across rivers and over hills, past herds of antelope and beneath skies so vast they seemed to swallow the earth. After a week of travel, they reached the land James had heard about, a beautiful valley with a creek running through it, protected by hills on 3 sides, with good grass and plenty of water. There was a land office in a small settlement called Benton's Crossing, and James filed a claim on 160 acres under the Homestead Act. They would have to live on the land and improve it for 5 years, but then it would be theirs completely. The first year was the hardest. They lived in the tent while James built a 1-room cabin, cutting logs from the hills and fitting them together with skill he had learned as a young man. Rosa plastered the walls with mud and grass, making them tight against the wind. They built a small barn for the horses, fenced a garden plot, and bought 6 head of cattle from a rancher 20 miles away. The work was brutal and endless. Rosa's hands, once soft from singing in the saloon, became calloused and strong. James's back ached from dawn to dusk. But every night they fell asleep in each other's arms, exhausted but content, knowing they were building something that was theirs. Other homesteaders in the valley were welcoming. There was a German family named Muller who shared seeds and advice, a widow named Abigail Hart who taught Rosa how to make butter and cheese, a young couple named the Johnsons who helped with the barn raising in exchange for help with their well. No one asked about Rosa's past, and if they had opinions, they kept them to themselves. By the second year, the cabin had 2 rooms and Rosa was pregnant. When she told James, he lifted her off the ground and spun her around, his face alight with joy. They had talked about children, dreamed about them, but having it become real was overwhelming. "A baby," James kept saying, touching Rosa's still flat stomach with wonder. "We are going to have a baby." Rosa's pregnancy was difficult. She was sick for months, and by the time the sickness passed, she was already showing. Abigail Hart became her constant companion, teaching her about childbirth and childcare, about the things a woman needed to know. The other women in the valley rallied around her, bringing food and supplies, offering support and friendship. In March of 1881, during a late winter storm, Rosa went into labor. Abigail and Martha Muller came to the cabin, and James was banished to the barn to pace and worry. The labor was long and hard, lasting through the night and into the next day. Rosa thought she might die from the pain, but then finally, a baby's cry split the air. "It is a boy," Abigail announced, bringing the wrapped bundle to Rosa. A beautiful, healthy boy. James was called in from the barn, and when he saw his son for the first time, tears streamed down his weathered face. "He is perfect," James whispered. "You are perfect, Rosa. Thank you." They named him Samuel Coleman Sullivan, after the circuit rider who had blessed their marriage. Little Sam had dark hair like his mother and green eyes like his father, and from the moment he drew breath, he became the center of their world. Raising a child on a homestead was challenging, but it was also filled with joy. Rosa sang Spanish lullabies to Sam while she worked, teaching him her mother's language along with English. James carved toys for him, taught him to ride almost before he could walk, showed him how to care for the animals and the land. The ranch grew slowly but steadily. By the time Sam was 3, they had 20 head of cattle, a flock of chickens, 2 pigs, and a milk cow. James had built a proper barn and expanded the cabin to 4 rooms. Rosa's garden flourished, providing vegetables for their table and extras to sell in Benton's Crossing. They were not rich, but they were comfortable. And more importantly, they were happy. In 1884, Rosa became pregnant again, and this time the pregnancy was easier. She gave birth to a daughter in the summer, a tiny thing with James's red gold hair and Rosa's dark eyes. They named her Grace Maria Sullivan, and Sam was utterly fascinated by his baby sister, constantly wanting to hold her and help care for her. Letters occasionally arrived from Cheyenne, forwarded through various channels. Mrs. Chen wrote faithfully twice a year, updating Rosa on town gossip. Sally Jenkins wrote once to say she had sold the Golden Rose and retired, moving to Denver to live with her niece. And surprisingly, in the winter of 1885, a letter arrived from Reverend Samuel Coleman. The circuit rider wrote that he had heard about their successful homestead through the Methodist network and wanted to congratulate them. He included news that he had confronted Pastor Thompson years earlier about his treatment of Rosa and James, though Thompson had been unmoved. Coleman wrote that he had since performed dozens of marriages for couples rejected by more established churches, and he considered James and Rosa's union one of his proudest moments. "Your love has created a family and a home," Coleman wrote. "You have proven that worth is not determined by circumstances, but by character. I pray God continues to bless you both." Rosa read the letter aloud to James as they sat on the porch of their cabin watching Sam chase chickens while Grace napped in a cradle nearby. "He remembers us," she said, touched by the Reverend's words. Of course he does, James said, pulling her close. What we have is worth remembering. We fought for each other, Rosa. We did not let judgment and prejudice win. Look at what we built because of that courage. Rosa looked out at the valley, at the cabin and barn, at the cattle grazing peacefully, at her children. She thought about how far she had come from that desperate young woman serving drinks in a saloon, how far they both had come from that painful moment in Pastor Thompson's church. I would do it all again, she said softly, and every hard moment, every challenge, every doubt, because it led me here, to you, to this life. As would I, James agreed, kissing the top of her head. The years continued to pass in a rhythm of seasons and growth. Sam grew into a serious, hard-working boy who loved the ranch and the animals. Grace was wild and joyful, always singing like her mother, always finding beauty in ordinary things. In 1887, Rosa gave birth to twins, two boys they named Thomas and Daniel, who kept the household in cheerful chaos. The ranch prospered enough that they were able to hire help during roundup season, and James became known throughout the territory as a fair man who treated his workers with respect, regardless of their background. Rosa became the unofficial teacher for the Mexican and immigrant families scattered through the valley, offering English lessons in their cabin during the winter months. When Sam turned 10, he asked about his parents' wedding story, and Rosa told him everything. She told him about the rejection at the church in Cheyenne, about tracking down Reverend Coleman, about the ceremony on the hillside. She told him about prejudice and judgment, but also about love and courage and the importance of standing up for what is right. So Grandpa Thompson refused to marry you because Mama used to work in a saloon? Sam asked, his young face serious. Yes, Rosa confirmed. She never lied to her children about her past. But that refusal led us to Reverend Coleman, who understood that love is what matters, not circumstances. And that journey led us here, to this valley, to this life. Sometimes closed doors lead to better paths. I am glad he refused then, Sam said, because I like our home. I like our life. So do I, son, James said, so do I. In 1890, when they had been married for 12 years and Sam was nearly 13, a visitor arrived at the ranch. It was a Sunday afternoon and the family was gathered outside enjoying the late summer sunshine. A single rider approached, and as he drew closer, Rosa felt a jolt of recognition. It was Reverend Samuel Coleman, older now, his hair gray, his face more lined, but his eyes still holding that same kindness and wisdom. Reverend Coleman, Rosa exclaimed, hurrying forward. What brings you all the way out here? Coleman dismounted stiffly, smiling broadly. I am making my final circuit before retirement, and I wanted to visit the couples whose weddings have meant the most to me. Yours was at the top of my list. They welcomed him with open arms, insisting he stay as long as he wished. Coleman remained for 3 days, and it was a time of celebration and reflection. He played his fiddle for the children, who were enchanted by the traveling preacher. He spoke at a gathering Rosa and James organized, bringing together all the families in the valley for a Sunday service under the open sky. On his last evening at the ranch, Coleman sat on the porch with James and Rosa after the children had gone to bed. The valley was peaceful in the twilight, the crickets singing their evening song. You have built something remarkable here, Coleman said. Not just a successful ranch, but a family filled with love, a community that looks to you as examples. I am proud to have played a small role in making this possible. You played the most important role, Rosa said. Without you, we might have given up, might have let others dictate our future. No, Coleman disagreed gently. You would have found a way. Love like yours always does. I simply had the privilege of blessing what God had already joined together. Before he left the next morning, Coleman performed a blessing over the entire family, praying for continued health, happiness, and prosperity. The children stood solemnly, even the twins behaving for once, as the Reverend's voice rang out over the valley. When Coleman rode away, Rosa felt a chapter closing, but not in a sad way. It felt like completion, like a circle being drawn around the story of their love and struggle and triumph. The 1890s brought new challenges and joys. Sam grew into a young man, strong and capable, taking on more responsibility at the ranch. Grace developed a beautiful singing voice and began performing at local gatherings, though she had no interest in anything like her mother's past career. The twins were wild and mischievous, but good-hearted, always into some adventure or another. James's hair turned silver, and Rosa found gray threads in her own dark locks, but they still looked at each other with the same love and desire that had driven them to track down a circuit rider through wild country all those years ago. They still danced in the kitchen when they thought no one was watching. They still held hands when they walked around the property. They still whispered, "I love you," every night before sleep. In 1895, tragedy struck when Abigail Hart passed away peacefully in her sleep. The entire valley mourned the woman who had been friend, midwife, and teacher to so many. Rosa helped organize the funeral and spoke about how Abigail had welcomed her without judgment, had helped bring all 4 of her children into the world, had shown her what it meant to be part of a community. But life continued, as it always does. Sam began courting Martha Johnson, the daughter of their neighbors, a sweet girl who loved the ranch life as much as he did. James and Rosa gave their blessing, and in the spring of 1897 they held a wedding at the ranch with a young Methodist minister from Benton's Crossing performing the ceremony. As Rosa watched her oldest child make his vows, she thought about her own wedding day, about the hillside and the sunset, about Reverend Coleman's kind eyes and the McDougall's joyful celebration. She thought about how that moment of rejection in Cheyenne had ultimately led to all of this: a thriving ranch, 4 healthy children, a community of friends, a love that had only grown deeper with time. "What are you thinking about?" James whispered, taking her hand as they watched Sam and Martha dance. "About how Pastor Thompson refusing to marry us was the best thing that ever happened to us," Rosa said. "If he had said yes, we might have stayed in Cheyenne, might have lived under the shadow of judgment forever. Instead, we found our own path, built our own life. We found freedom." James squeezed her hand. "We found each other. Everything else came from that." By 1898, Sam and Martha had given them their first grandchild, a boy they named James Coleman Johnson Sullivan. Rosa held her grandson and felt the weight of time and blessing, of how much had changed since she was a frightened young woman serving drinks in a saloon, of how much joy could come from standing firm in love against the forces of judgment. Grace announced her engagement to a school teacher from Benton's Crossing, a quiet man who loved her wild spirit. The twins were nearly grown, already standing taller than their father, planning to homestead their own land in the next valley over. The ranch was profitable enough that James and Rosa could afford to help them get started, to give them the boost they had never had. As they approached the turn of the century, James and Rosa sat on their porch one evening, watching the sun set over the valley they had claimed and tamed and loved. They were in their 40s now, their children grown or nearly so, their hair gray, their bodies marked by years of hard work, but their hands were still entwined, their hearts still beating in rhythm. "Do you ever think about Cheyenne?" James asked. "About Pastor Thompson, about what he said to us?" "Sometimes," Rosa admitted, "but not with anger anymore. I think about how he thought he was punishing us, but he actually freed us. He forced us to find our own way, to build something better than what we would have had in his church, in his town." "I wonder if he ever knew that," James mused. "If he ever realized that his judgment pushed us toward happiness instead of away from it." "Probably not," Rosa said. "Men like that rarely see the consequences of their cruelty. But it does not matter. We won, James. We loved each other, married each other, built a life together despite his refusal. That is the only victory that matters." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge, the same stars that had watched over them on their wedding night on the McDougall Ranch, the same stars that had guided them through years of struggle and triumph. "I love you, Rosa Sullivan," James said, the words as fresh and sincere as they had been 20 years earlier. "I love you, James Sullivan," Rosa replied, "forever and always." In the early 1900s, as the new century began, the Sullivan Ranch stood as a testament to what love and determination could build. 4 children, all successful and happy in their own ways, a herd of over 100 cattle, fertile land that provided abundantly, a community that respected and admired them, and most importantly, a marriage that had weathered every storm and emerged stronger. When Grace married her school teacher in a ceremony at the ranch, with Sam's children running wild through the grass and the twins acting as groomsmen, Rosa looked around at the gathering and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. There were neighbors and friends from across the valley, people from Benton's Crossing, even some travelers who had heard about the Sullivan hospitality and wanted to witness the celebration. As the dancing began and James pulled her into his arms for a waltz, Rosa thought about that desperate journey across the Wyoming Territory, tracking down a circuit rider who would bless their love when others had cursed it. She thought about Reverend Coleman's fiddle playing at their wedding, about the McDougal's kindness, about every person who had shown them grace when others showed judgment. "Thank you," she whispered to James as they danced. "For what?" he asked. "For fighting for us. For not giving up when Pastor Thompson refused. For loving me enough to ride across the territory and find someone who would see us for what we really were." James pulled her closer. "You never have to thank me for loving you, Rosa. It has been the greatest privilege of my life." The years that followed were gentler, marked by the pleasures of grandchildren and the satisfaction of a life well lived. Sam and Martha had 3 more children. Grace and her husband had 2. The twins both married, one to a rancher's daughter, one to a girl from town, and they established their own successful homesteads in the next valley, close enough to visit but far enough to be independent. James and Rosa gradually turned over more of the ranch operations to Sam, though they still worked every day, still found purpose in the rhythms of ranch life. They added a comfortable rocking chair porch to the cabin, now a sprawling house that had been added onto many times over the years, and they spent their evenings there, watching the sunset and counting their blessings. In 1908, word reached them that Pastor Elijah Thompson had died in Cheyenne. Rosa felt a complicated mix of emotions when she heard the news. She did not rejoice in his death, but she also could not mourn him. He had tried to deny her the happiness she deserved, had judged her without knowing her, had put social propriety above Christian compassion. "Should we feel guilty that we are not sad?" Rosa asked James. "No," James said firmly. "We can acknowledge that he was a child of God without forgiving what he tried to do to us. His rejection hurt you deeply, Rosa. You do not have to pretend otherwise just because he has died." That honesty, that refusal to sugarcoat difficult truths, was one of the things Rosa loved most about her husband. He had never asked her to be anything other than herself, had never demanded she hide her feelings or her past. As they entered their 60s, James and Rosa became the matriarch and patriarch of not just their family but the entire valley. Young couples came to them for advice. Struggling homesteaders came to them for help. Children came to hear Grandma Rosa's stories and taste her famous empanadas. Everyone knew that the Sullivan Ranch was a place of welcome and acceptance, where judgment was left at the gate, and love was offered freely. In 1912, on a warm June day, James and Rosa celebrated their 34th wedding anniversary. Their children and grandchildren gathered at the ranch for a massive celebration. Sam, now a man of 35 with silver threading his dark hair, stood and offered a toast. "To my parents," he said, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd, "who taught us that love is not about finding someone perfect, but about loving someone perfectly. Who showed us that the opinions of small-minded people matter less than the truth of your own heart. Who built a life and a legacy that will endure for generations." Everyone raised their glasses, and Rosa felt tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. She looked at James, saw him crying too, and they held each other while their family cheered. That night, after everyone had left or gone to bed in the various cabins and barns scattered around the property, James and Rosa walked hand in hand to the creek that ran through their land. The moon was full, painting everything silver, and the sound of the water was soothing. "Do you remember the night we camped by a creek like this?" James asked, "on our way to find Reverend Coleman?" "I remember everything about that journey," Rosa said. "I was so scared, but also so hopeful. I believed in you, believed in us, but I did not know if the world would let us be together." "The world tried to stop us," James said, "but we did not let it. We made our own world instead." "A better world," Rosa added. They stood by the creek for a long time, two people who had fought for their love and won, who had built something beautiful out of rejection and struggle, who had proven that grace and courage and commitment could overcome any obstacle. The Sullivan legacy continued long after James and Rosa were gone. Their children told stories about the couple who had tracked down a circuit rider through wild territory to marry them when the town preacher refused. Their grandchildren grew up hearing about the power of standing firm in love against judgment. Their great-grandchildren inherited not just land and cattle, but the values of compassion, acceptance, and the courage to fight for what is right. But in the summer of 1915, as James and Rosa sat on their porch in the golden evening light, surrounded by the life they had built, they were not thinking about legacy or future generations. They were simply content. Two souls who had found each other against the odds, who had loved each other through joy and hardship, who had created a family and a home and a story worth telling. "If you could go back," James asked quietly, "knowing everything that would happen, would you still walk into that church with me? Would you still face Pastor Thompson's rejection?" Rosa turned to look at her husband, this man who had loved her when the world told him not to, who had fought for her when others said she was not worth fighting for, who had spent 37 years proving every single day that she was his most precious treasure. "Without hesitation," she said, "because every moment of pain led us here. Every rejection opened a door to something better. Every obstacle we overcame made our love stronger. I would walk that path 1,000 times if it meant ending up here, with you, with this life we built together." James smiled, the same smile that had first captured her heart in a crowded saloon all those years ago. "That is exactly what I hoped you would say." They sat together as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Two people who had refused to let judgment define them, who had found a circuit rider willing to bless what others had cursed, who had built a love story for the ages in the wild heart of the American West. And as the stars began to emerge one by one, the same stars that had watched over their wedding night and every night since, Rosa and James Sullivan knew with absolute certainty that every struggle had been worth it, that love truly could conquer all, and that their story would live on long after they were gone, an inspiration to anyone who ever had to fight for the right to love freely and completely. Their hands remained entwined as darkness fell, two hearts beating as one, a testament to the power of love to transform rejection into redemption, judgment into joy, and two uncertain souls into an unshakable partnership that had stood the test of time and would endure in memory and legacy forever.